The scent of jasmine and expensive scotch hung heavy in the humid night air. Conversations hummed around us, low and dangerous, but I only felt Colette's hand pressing against the small of my back. Her palm was burning hot, possessive, a terrifying contrast to the cold calculation in her eyes. I turned, catching her gaze, and for a split second, the mission dissolved. I wasn't an operative. I was a woman drowning in her stare. Then her fingers dug in, sharp and warning. She leaned in, breath ghosting my ear. "Stop looking at me like that. You're blowing our cover." Reality snapped back into place. 48 hours earlier, the only scent in the air was stale coffee and ozone. We sat in the briefing room, the fluorescent lights humming a headache into my temples. Colette sat across from me, spine steel straight, reading the file with the clinical detachment that made her the best operative in the division. She treated emotions like variables in an equation, things to be isolated and eliminated. I relied on instinct. She relied on precision. It was why we worked. The director tossed a tablet onto the table. "Markov, the Amalfi Coast. He's hosting a private summit at his villa." The mission was simple on paper. Infiltrate the inner circle of a reclusive arms dealer. The method, however, was a nightmare. We weren't going in as tactical support. We were going in as Vanessa and Julianne, a wealthy, newly engaged couple looking to invest in Markov's shipping logistics. I glanced at Colette. We had worked together for 3 years. We survived because we maintained a strict, sterile distance. We were efficient machinery. This cover required us to dismantle the very walls that kept us alive. "You want us to play house," Colette said, her voice flat. "For a week." The director didn't blink. "I want you to be convincing. Markov is paranoid. He trusts relationships, not resumes. If he doubts you for a second, you don't come home." We spent the next 12 hours memorizing a history that didn't exist. We learned the date of our fictional first date, the name of the fictional dog we adopted, the story of how she proposed in a vineyard in Tuscany. We had to learn how to touch. Not the efficient taps of extracting a weapon, but the lingering, useless touches of people in love. We practiced holding hands across a table until my palms sweat. It felt like learning a script for a play where the audience had guns. Then came the wardrobe. I watched my tactical gear get packed away, replaced by silk, chiffon, and heels that cost more than my first car. Colette traded her utility belt for diamond earrings. I watched her hold up a dress that was little more than a whisper of red silk. "It offers 0 protection," she noted, analyzing the fabric like it was defective armor. "It offers access," I corrected. "That's the point." The flight over was the first test. As soon as the wheels left the tarmac, English was forbidden. We switched to French, the language of our cover identities. Colette's posture changed. She softened, leaning back, crossing her legs with a casual elegance that felt alien. She looked at me, and her eyes weren't the eyes of my partner anymore. They were softer, heavier. It was a performance, I knew that. But when she reached over to adjust the collar of my blouse, her knuckles brushing my collarbone, my pulse jumped. The contact was electric, startlingly intimate after years of avoiding touch. The silence between us wasn't the companionable silence of partners scanning a perimeter. It was charged, heavy with the proximity of our knees touching in the cramped first-class cabin. The car ride up the cliffside was an assault on the senses. The air conditioning of the plane gave way to the open windows of a vintage convertible, the smell of salt and lemons rushing in. The Mediterranean stretched out below us, a blinding, impossible blue. Colette drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the gear shift, dangerously close to my knee. We were speeding toward a fortress of marble and violence, but looking at her profile against the Italian sky, I felt a different kind of danger taking root. The lines between the mission and the woman were starting to blur before we even reached the gate. The tires crunched over white gravel as we pulled up to the entrance. This was it. The moment the engine died, the reality of us had to begin. A valet opened my door, but Colette was there instantly, offering her hand to help me out. Her grip was firm, professional, but her smile was a weapon, dazzling and completely fabricated. "Ready, darling?" she asked in flawless French. I took her hand, and the performance washed over us. The lobby was a cathedral of intimidation. Everything was marble and gold, designed to make you feel small and lucky to be there. The air smelled of expensive lilies and old money. I felt the weight of eyes immediately. Security disguised as concierges, surveillance cameras hidden in Rococo molding. We walked to the desk, Colette's arm looped through mine, her body heat radiating against my side. It wasn't comfort. It was a constant reminder of the lie. Our suite was worse. It was beautiful, terrifyingly so. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sea, a bathroom larger than my apartment, and in the center, a bed that looked like a battlefield. It was vast, draped in white linens, forcing an immediate, silent confrontation with the fact that there were no other rooms. No couch, no boundaries, just a space designed for lovers. "The view is incredible," Colette said, her voice bright, carrying to the vents. She moved to the window, pulling me with her. It was time for the sweep. We moved in a synchronized dance we'd perfected in training, but adapted for this stage. She embraced me from behind, pointing out the yachts in the harbor, while her other hand ran a frequency detector along the curtain rods. I laughed at a joke she didn't make, leaning my head back against her shoulder, scanning the light fixtures for lenses. We were intimate strangers, performing passion while hunting for bugs. "Clear," she whispered against my neck, the word indistinguishable from a lover's secret. She pulled away instantly, the warmth vanishing, leaving my skin cold. The luggage arrived and the reality of the wardrobe set in. I opened my suitcase to a sea of sheer fabrics and plunging necklines. Colette stood by the dresser, methodically unpacking her own weapons disguised as accessories. She picked up a slip dress of black silk, holding it up against me with clinical detachment. "Too much coverage for the gala," she critiqued, her eyes scanning the fabric, not for its beauty, but for where I could hide a comms unit. "We need you visible, vulnerable." "I feel vulnerable," I muttered, snatching the dress back. "You look stiff," she countered. She stepped closer, invading my personal space with the authority of a drill sergeant. "Your hand placement is wrong. When you touch me, you hesitate. Julianne doesn't hesitate. She knows she belongs there." She took my hand, placing it on her waist, pressing it into the curve of her hip. "Here. You own this space. Claim it." "It's tactical," I said, my voice sounding tight. "It's necessary," she corrected. She moved my other hand to her neck, her fingers cool against my wrist. "When you lean in, don't pull back. Lean." She demonstrated, stepping into me until our bodies were flush. I could smell her perfume, sandalwood, and something sharper, like gun oil. The friction of her skin against mine wasn't the sterile contact of sparring. It burned. My breath hitched, a traitorous reaction to her proximity. She was teaching me mechanics, coordinates of flesh and bone, but my body was reading it as desire. "Better," she said, stepping back abruptly. The loss of contact was a physical blow. "Get changed. Dinner is in 20 minutes, and Markov is already downstairs." The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the room in bruised purples. The heavy oak doors to the dining room swung open, and the atmosphere shifted instantly. It wasn't just the cloying scent of truffle oil and roasted game, or the low murmur of 50 wealthy conversations. It was the sudden, crushing weight of visibility. Colette stepped through the threshold ahead of me, and for a second, I forgot my own name. The red dress was a masterpiece of engineering, designed to distract and disarm. It left her back entirely bare, a vast expanse of pale skin that drew every eye in the room like a magnet. She paused, turning to me with a smile that was equal parts invitation and challenge, and the transformation was so complete, it was terrifying. The cold, efficient partner I knew was gone, replaced by a woman who moved like she was made of liquid fire. We spotted Markov immediately. He was impossible to miss, seated at the best table in the room, his back protected by a wall of reinforced glass. He wasn't eating. He was watching. His gaze swept the room like a searchlight, lingering on anything that moved. We didn't shy away. Colette guided us to a table directly in his line of sight, effectively placing us center stage. We weren't here to hide in the shadows. We were here to be the entertainment. The moment we sat, the world narrowed down to the 2 feet of white tablecloth between us. This was the most dangerous part of the cover, the public intimacy. We had to look like we were the only 2 people on Earth. I reached for her hand across the table, interlacing our fingers. Her skin was cool, her grip steady. "He's watching," she murmured, her lips barely moving, her expression one of adoring fascination. 3:00. Don't look yet. "I'm only looking at you," I said, and the words felt heavy in my mouth. I picked up my fork, spearing a piece of melon wrapped in prosciutto, and held it to her lips. It was a cliché, a gesture so saccharine it made my teeth ache, but Colette leaned into it. She took the bite, her eyes locking onto mine, her tongue darting out to catch a drop of oil on her lip. The intimacy of it, the trust required to let someone feed you, the vulnerability of the open mouth, sent a jolt of electricity straight to my spine. Then she escalated. Her hand slipped from the table and landed on my thigh. It was heavy, warm, and possessive. I nearly jumped. Under the table, hidden by the long tablecloth, her fingers splayed out, claiming the muscle, the thumb rubbing slow, deliberate circles against the silk of my dress. It was a tactical anchor, a way to keep us physically connected so we could signal silently. I knew that. I knew it was tradecraft, but my body didn't speak that language. My body reacted with a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the mission. I felt the burn of her touch branding me, blurring the line between the role I was playing and the want I was suppressing. "We should get the house at the library," Colette said, her voice dripping with affection, while her nails dug slightly into my leg. "Security detail is rotating." "I thought you wanted the city apartment," I countered, leaning in, brushing a stray hair from her forehead. 2 guards at the kitchen door. "I want whatever you want," she whispered. The lie tasted sweet. The waiter materialized like a ghost, breaking the tension. He held a dusty bottle of wine. "Compliments of Monsieur Markov," he intoned. We turned. Markov raised his glass, his smile sharp as a blade. The invitation had been issued. Markov didn't wait for an invitation. He moved through the dining room with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a storm front, his security detail trailing a discreet 3 paces behind. Up close, the charm was a thin veneer over something rotting. His eyes were flat, shark-like, assessing the caloric value of everything they touched. "The wine is a 96, he said, his voice a gravelly rumble that vibrated in the centerpiece. "I hope it suits your palate. It requires patience." "We have plenty of that," Colette replied, her voice smooth as glass. She didn't stand, she didn't offer her hand. She simply tilted her head, exposing the long, elegant line of her throat, a calculated display of confidence that bordered on arrogance. Markov pulled out the chair opposite us, the wood scraping against the marble floor, a sound like a bone snapping. "You are new to the coast," he stated, not asking. "I know everyone who moves money in this region. I do not know you." This was the test. 1 wrong syllable, 1 micro-expression of fear, and we would be dead before dessert. Colette took a sip of the wine, her eyes locking with his over the rim. "We prefer to remain unknown, Mr. Markov. Fame is expensive. Anonymity is profitable." She launched into the cover story, weaving the lie with a terrifying ease. She spoke of the investment firm, the quiet acquisitions, the sabbatical taken to celebrate our engagement. She gestured to me with a fondness that looked so genuine, it made my stomach turn. Julianne was burning out. I had to drag her away from the terminal. I played my role, the exhausted, adoring fiancé. I leaned into her, resting my chin on her shoulder, letting my eyes drift half shut. "She calls it kidnapping," I murmured, reaching out to trace the line of Colette's bracelet. "I call it a rescue." Markov wasn't satisfied. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, invading our intimate circle. He ignored me completely, turning his full, predatory attention to Colette. "A woman with your sharpness must find a permanent vacation tedious." His gaze dropped to her neckline, then back to her eyes, lingering with an insolence that was a direct challenge. "Perhaps you need more stimulating company, someone who understands the complexities of the world, rather than someone who needs rescuing." It was a blatant dismissal of me, a test of our dynamic. He was flirting with her, aggressively, trying to wedge himself into the cracks of our relationship. I didn't have to search for the anger. It didn't come from my training or the dossier. It flared hot and fast in my chest, a primal, possessive spike of adrenaline that shocked me. I wasn't just defending the cover. I was defending her. I sat up, shedding the exhaustion instantly. My hand shot out, wrapping around Colette's waist, my fingers digging into the silk and the firm muscle beneath. I pulled her physically closer to me, a sharp, territorial jerk that made the silverware rattle. "She isn't looking for stimulation," I said, my voice low, dropping the soft, deferential tone I'd been using. I stared directly at Markov, letting the jealousy bleed out of my pores. She's exactly where she wants to be. The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke on. Markov paused, his eyes flicking to my hand on her waist, assessing the threat level. I held my breath. I had broken character, shifted from passive to aggressive. If Colette pulled away, if she showed even a flicker of annoyance at my possessiveness, we were done. But she didn't. She melted. Colette leaned back into my embrace, covering my hand with hers, interlacing our fingers against her hip. She looked at Markov, then turned to me, her expression softening into something devastatingly tender. "She's right," she said to him, but she was looking at me. "I have everything I need, right here." Markov stared at us for a long second, then threw his head back and laughed, a dry, barking sound. "Young love," he dismissed, standing up. "Possessive, volatile. I like that." He nodded to Colette, a lingering look that promised unfinished business, and walked away. We didn't move until he was out of the room. The walk back to the suite was a blur of silent corridors. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving my hands shaking, but the ghost of her body heat against my side felt heavier than the gun in my luggage. The heavy click of the suite door locking behind us sucked the oxygen right out of the room. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was pressurized. We were back in the cage, sealed in with the scent of lilies and the lingering, suffocating residue of the performance we'd just delivered. My hand still burned where I had gripped Colette's waist, a phantom sensation of silk and muscle that refused to fade. I leaned back against the door, closing my eyes, trying to regulate a heart rate that had no business being this high. The adrenaline from the confrontation with Markov was draining away, leaving behind a shaky, hollow exhaustion and a dangerous, vibrating awareness of the woman standing 10 feet away. Colette didn't lean. She didn't exhale. She moved instantly into protocol, shedding the persona of the adoring fiancé like a snake shedding skin. She swept the room with her eyes, checking sightlines, her posture reverting to that familiar, rigid efficiency. She walked to the balcony doors and slid them open, letting the roar of the ocean wash over the silence. "He suspects something," she said, her voice stripped of all warmth, back to the cool, clipped cadence of the architect. She stepped out into the night air, turning her back to me. But he bought the jealousy. That was effective improvisation. I pushed off the door, my legs feeling heavy, and followed her out. The transition from the climate-controlled suite to the raw, humid night was jarring. The wind was picking up, whipping strands of hair across my face and tangling the hem of my dress around my legs. Below us, the sea crashed against the cliffs, a chaotic, churning black void illuminated only by the jagged silver path of the moon. It wasn't improvisation, I wanted to say. The words sat heavy on my tongue, tasting of iron. Instead, I gripped the cold metal railing, needing something solid to anchor myself. "He's arrogant," I said, my voice sounding thinner than I intended. "He thinks he can charm you away. He didn't expect a fight." Colette turned to look at me. The moonlight washed the color from her dress, turning the red silk into liquid shadow. She looked tired. For the first time since we left the briefing room, I saw the fine lines of tension bracketing her eyes. "He expects everyone to have a price," she corrected, her gaze drifting past me to the horizon, refusing to land. "He was checking yours." She reached up to remove her earrings, long, heavy cascades of diamonds that caught the moonlight with every breath she took. It was a simple, mechanical gesture, a shedding of the costume. But in the quiet intimacy of the balcony, it felt devastating. She tilted her head to the side, exposing the long, pale column of her neck, her fingers fumbling slightly with the clasp. The movement was uncharacteristically clumsy, a crack in the armor of the woman who never missed a target. I watched her. I couldn't help it. The tactical part of my brain, the part that should have been analyzing Markov's security detail or planning the clone operation for the morning, had gone silent. All I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears and the memory of her body pressed against mine in the dining room. I watched her reflection in the dark glass of the balcony door, the curve of her shoulder, the focus in her eyes, the vulnerability of her bare neck. And in that split second, I forgot to guard myself. I forgot the mission. I forgot that she was the architect and I was just the asset. I let the mask slip completely. I looked at her with all the terrified, raw hunger that I had been suppressing for 3 years. I looked at her like I wanted to consume her. Colette froze, her hand stilled on her earlobe. She saw it. She saw the truth of it reflected in the glass, stripped of any cover story or pretense. The silence stretched, tight and screaming, for 3 heartbeats. She turned slowly, her face hard, her eyes wide and dark. The diamond swung from her hand, catching the light. "Stop looking at me like that," she whispered. The words were sharp, breathless, like she'd been struck. "You're blowing our cover." It wasn't a warning about Markov. There were no cameras on the balcony. There were no guards. It was a warning about us. She wasn't afraid I looked fake. She was terrified because I looked real. The intensity of it, the sheer, undeniable weight of the want was the danger. It was the variable she couldn't control. She didn't wait for a response. She turned on her heel, the silk of her dress snapping in the wind, and walked back into the suite. A moment later, the bathroom door clicked shut, and the lock turned with a decisive snap. I stood alone on the balcony, the taste of salt on my lips, listening to the ocean crash against the rocks. The wall between us hadn't just been rebuilt, it had been fortified with steel. I stayed there until the cold seeped into my bones, knowing that morning would bring the sun, but it wouldn't bring any warmth. The morning sun over the Amalfi Coast didn't feel like a blessing. It felt like an interrogation lamp. It was bright, white, and unyielding, exposing every micro-expression we tried to hide behind oversized sunglasses. The distance between the twin beds in the suite had felt like a canyon all night, a silence filled with the echo of her rejection on the balcony. But down here, on the scorched white stone of the pool deck, the mission forced us back into each other's orbit with a jarring lack of ceremony. The objective was simple. Markov swam laps every morning at 9. He left his phone on the teak side table, guarded by a man who looked like he chewed glass for breakfast. We needed to clone the device, which meant getting my clutch, containing a high-powered localized scanner, within 3 feet of that table, and then creating a distraction big enough to keep the guard's eyes off the blinking LED light for 90 seconds. "Turn around," Colette said. Her voice was flat, hidden behind tortoiseshell frames that masked her eyes completely. We were 2 loungers away from Markov. I lay on my stomach, the heat of the stone radiating up through the towel, while she knelt beside me. She squeezed a dollop of sunscreen onto her palms, the sound of the bottle snapping shut echoing like a gunshot in the quiet morning. Her hands touched my skin, and my entire body went rigid. Her palms were cool, slick with the coconut-scented lotion, moving in efficient, tactical circles between my shoulder blades. It was a necessity, a way to speak without moving our lips, a justification for her proximity. But to my traitorous nerve endings, it felt like a brand. After the rejection on the balcony, this professional intimacy was a specific kind of torture. She worked the lotion into the tension of my shoulders, her thumbs digging into the muscle with a familiarity that made my breath hitch. "He's on lap 12, she murmured, her voice barely audible over the ambient lounge music. "The guard is distracted by the waitress. You need to drop the bag now." "I know," I whispered back, my face pressed into the crook of my arm to hide the flush rising on my neck. "Your hands are cold." "Focus," she commanded, sliding her hand down the curve of my spine to my lower back. The contact burned. "Get up. Let's go." I sat up, grabbing my oversized straw hat and the clutch. We walked toward the pool's edge, a performance of leisurely wealth. As we passed Markov's chair, I stumbled, a calculated clumsiness, and dropped the bag right next to the table leg. I apologized to the air, laughed it off with a vapid giggle, and kept moving toward the water, leaving the scanner in position. The water was a shock of cold turquoise. We surfaced, gasping, and I splashed her, a scripted moment of playful exuberance that felt jagged and wrong after the silence of the suite. Colette laughed, a bright, manufactured sound that didn't reach her eyes, and splashed back. We had to be loud. We had to be the annoying, happy couple that drew every eye on the deck, pulling focus from the small bag humming with data near the target. Closer, she hissed through a smile, grabbing my waist and pulling me into the deep end. The water changed the dynamic instantly. It stripped away the gravity, the friction. Her dress was gone, replaced by a black swimsuit that was devastating in its simplicity. We treaded water, legs tangling beneath the surface. To the guard watching us with mild irritation, we were lovers, lost in a moment. 30 seconds, she whispered against my wet cheek, her arms wrapping around my neck. The water hid the trembling of my hands as I held her waist. Her skin was slick, cool, and terrifyingly soft. I looked at her, water droplets clinging to her lashes, and for a second, the anger from the night before flared hot in my chest. She was using this, using us, with such clinical precision. He's getting out, I warned, watching over her shoulder as Markov pulled himself from the pool. Hold me, she ordered. Don't let go. She pressed her forehead against mine, closing her eyes. We floated there, suspended in the blue, chest to chest, sharing the same breath while the download completed. The intimacy was suffocating. It wasn't just a cover. It was a weapon she was wielding against me, and we both knew it. Done, I breathed, as a subtle vibration of the confirmation signal buzzed against my wrist. We pulled apart, the water rushing into the space between us. Climbing out of the pool, shivering as the air hit my wet skin, I grabbed a towel and wrapped it tight, not just for warmth, but to put a barrier back up. The tension wasn't just sexual anymore. It was sharp, angry, and fueled by the confusion of a woman who didn't know if she was being held or handled. Night fell over the coast, transforming the azure view into a wall of obsidian. The suite was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath before the plunge. On the bed, the red dress lay like a pool of spilled wine. It was my turn to be the distraction. Colette had worn the armor of exposure at dinner. Tonight, she had chosen a different weapon. I stepped into the silk, the fabric cool and fluid against my skin, settling over my hips with an unforgiving intimacy. It fit like a second skin, leaving absolutely nowhere to hide a weapon, a wire, or a tremor of fear. I stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, smoothing the fabric down, when Colette walked into the frame. My breath caught in my throat. She was wearing a tuxedo, sharp, severe, and devastatingly elegant. The masculine cut of the black wool only highlighted the feminine grace of her movement as she approached. She had slicked her hair back, exposing the sharp line of her jaw. She looked like a predator in formal wear. She stopped behind me, her eyes meeting mine in the glass. The air in the room instantly pressurized, heavy with the memory of the balcony and the pool. "The zipper," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a directive. I turned my back to her, sweeping my hair over my shoulder. It was a classic trope, but in the silence of that suite, it felt suffocatingly intense. I felt her knuckles brush the bare skin of my spine, a ghost of a touch that sent a shiver rattling through my ribcage. The sound of the zipper rising was a slow, tearing noise in the quiet room. She didn't step away when it was done. She stayed there, hovering in the space behind me, her heat radiating into my exposed back. "The speeches start at 10, she whispered, her breath hot against the sensitive skin below my ear. Her hand settled on my waist, not caressing, but grounding. The grip was firm, professional, yet my body leaned back instinctively. "That's our window. We need to be in the private study by 10:05. We need a reason to disappear." "We'll make a scene," I whispered back, watching her hands on my waist in the mirror. They looked possessive. "A lover's quarrel?" "No," she said, her grip tightening just enough to bruise. "We don't fight tonight. Tonight, we are inseparable. We disappear to be alone." We descended into the ballroom, a cavern of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers, filled with people hiding behind elaborate Venetian masks. The anonymity provided a false sense of security, a sea of faceless decadence where everyone was watching, but no one was seeing. But I knew exactly where Colette was. I could feel her presence like a gravitational pull. We moved through the crowd, accepting champagne we didn't drink, smiling at jokes we didn't hear. The orchestra swelled, shifting from ambient noise to a deliberate, pulsing waltz. Dance, Colette commanded softly, taking my hand before I could object. We moved to the floor. She led, of course. Her hand found the small of my back, right where the dress dipped lowest, skin on skin. The contact was electric. We moved in a tight, synchronized orbit, our bodies brushing with every turn. It was a physical conversation, a negotiation of space and power. "You're holding on too tight," I murmured, leaning in close so only she could hear. I looked up at her, searching for the partner behind the mask, but all I saw was the intensity of the woman who had nearly broken on the balcony. "You're making it real, Colette." She didn't pull away. She didn't correct her grip. Instead, her hand slid lower, pressing me firmly against her, eliminating the last inch of professional distance. "Maybe," she said, her voice rough. "I need it to look real to survive it." The music crested, a soaring crescendo of strings. Over her shoulder, I saw Markov move toward the private wing, his security detail trailing behind. The target was in motion. The dance was over. Colette's grip tightened one last time, an acknowledgement of the truth we couldn't speak, before she spun me toward the exit. We slipped from the golden haze of the ballroom into the velvet silence of the private wing. The music faded to a distant rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat buried under floorboards. Instantly, the lovers vanished, replaced by the operators. Colette moved with a predator's grace, the sharp lines of her tuxedo blending into the shadows. We reached the heavy mahogany doors of the study. No words. The telepathy of survival took over. I watched the hallway while she went to work on the lock. Her hands, so possessive on the dance floor, were now surgical instruments. She produced a tension wrench from her cufflink. Click. We were inside. The study smelled of stale cigar smoke and secrets. The darkness felt heavy, oppressive, amplifying the sound of our breathing. "Desk," she whispered. "I'll check the safe." We moved in the dark, guided only by moonlight. I rifled through the drawers, fingers flying over files. Nothing. Then, the sound of heavy boots on marble. "Guard," I hissed. The footsteps were slowing down. He was 10 feet away. There was nowhere to hide. Colette didn't hesitate. She crossed the room in 2 strides, eyes wild. She grabbed the lapels of my red dress. "We don't hide," she breathed. "We sell it." She slammed me against the bookshelf. The spines of legal text dug into my bare skin. Before I could even inhale, her mouth was on mine. It was supposed to be a cover, a desperate improvisation to convince a guard that 2 drunk guests were looking for a bedroom. But the moment her lips touched mine, the lie disintegrated. It wasn't a stage kiss. It was a collision. 3 years of repressed longing detonated in a single second. There was no acting in the way her hands tangled in my hair, or the way a sound, half whimper, half growl, vibrated in her throat. I tasted the champagne she hadn't drunk and the terrifying heat of her surrender. It was a starving thing. It was the answer to every question I'd asked the ceiling of my hotel room for 3 years. I forgot the guard. I wrapped my legs around her waist, pulling her into me, needing to be closer than physics allowed. The door handle turned. A flashlight beam cut across the ceiling, catching red silk and black wool. "Scusi!" The guard's voice was thick with embarrassment. "Apologies, signoras." The door clicked shut, sealing us in. The footsteps retreated, hurried, awkward. We were safe, but we were drowning. We should have stopped. The threat was gone. But we didn't. Colette didn't pull away. She deepened the kiss, her tongue tracing the seam of my lips, demanding entry. I gave it to her. I gave her everything. My hands gripped the shoulders of her tuxedo, anchoring myself in the storm. This wasn't the mission anymore. This was Colette, stripping away the architect, stripping away the rules. For 3 heartbeats, 3 eternities, we stayed there, pressed against the law books, breathing each other's air, lost in the wreckage of our professional boundaries. Then she broke it. She pulled back, chest heaving, lips swollen. Her eyes were wide with panic. We stared at each other in the gloom, the silence screaming. We had crossed the line. There was no going back. "The ledger," she rasped, her voice wrecked. She turned away, hands shaking as she reached behind a painting. She cracked the safe in seconds, muscle memory overriding emotional shock. She grabbed the black book, shoved it into her jacket pocket over her heart, and grabbed my hand. "Move," she commanded. But her grip wasn't tactical anymore. It was desperate. We exited the room, blending back into the shadows, but the taste of her was still on my mouth, a lingering promise that terrified me more than any gun Markov could point at us. Walking back through the ballroom was an exercise in dissociation. My body was moving, smiling, dodging waiters, but my mind was stuck in that study. The heat of Colette's body against mine felt tattooed onto my skin, a phantom pressure making the silk feel abrasive. We made it to the valet stand, the cool night air hitting my flushed face. The car arrived, a sleek, black extraction vehicle, and we slid into the back seat. The door closed, sealing us in darkness. The silence wasn't tactical. It was heavy with everything unsaid. Colette stared out the window, her profile sharp against the streetlights, gripping her knees until her knuckles turned white. I could hear her shallow, controlled breathing, betraying how close she was to shattering. We drove down winding cliffside roads, the black sea crashing below. Every time the car took a sharp turn, our shoulders brushed, sending a fresh wave of electricity through me. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. She existed in a suspended state of rigid control, staring at the glass as if looking for a sniper, but I knew she was just trying not to look at me. The handoff at the airfield was a blur. I handed over the drive, signed the logs, and nodded at the support team, operating on autopilot, while my actual self was still vibrating from the taste of her mouth. We were released to the safe house, a nondescript villa halfway up the mountain, designed to be forgotten. We entered in silence. It smelled of dust and lemon polish, a sterile scent jarring after the gala. I kicked off my heels, the relief immediate, and walked into the kitchen for water. My hands were shaking. I heard Colette in the living room, the rustle of fabric as she removed her jacket. I found her by the unlit fireplace. She had taken off the tuxedo jacket and undone the bow tie, leaving it hanging loose around her neck like an unraveled noose. She looked wrecked. Beautiful, but wrecked. She was staring at the empty grate, her arms crossed tight over her chest, protecting the space where the ledger had been, or maybe just holding herself together. "We need to talk about the study," I said. My voice sounded loud. Colette didn't turn. We improvised. The guard was approaching. It was the only viable distraction. We secured the objective. "Don't." I stepped closer. "Don't give me the mission report. I was there, Colette. I felt you." She turned, eyes defensive. "It was necessary cover. You know the protocol. We do what we have to do to survive." "Is that all it was?" I pushed. "Just survival?" "Because when the door closed, you didn't stop. You held on to me like you were drowning." She flinched. "I was running on adrenaline," she deflected, voice lacking its usual steel. "The situation was high stress." "I know the difference between adrenaline and want," I whispered. I reached out, my fingers hovering near her arm but not touching. "I know the difference between a cover and the truth." "You kissed me back, Colette. You kissed me like you've wanted to for 3 years. I felt the specific texture of it. I felt you surrender." She looked at my hand, then my eyes. The silence stretched, agonizing. The architect was trying to rebuild the walls, but the mortar was wet. "And if I did?" The admission tore out of her. "If I did want it? Look at us. I rely on precision. I rely on control. Wanting this, wanting you, it compromises everything. It makes me messy. It makes me weak. It makes you human, Colette," I countered. "I can't afford to be human," she said, voice cracking. "Not in this line of work. Not with you." Morning arrived without the mercy of a sunrise. The light filtering into the safe house kitchen was gray and brutally honest, stripping away the golden haze of the Amalfi Coast and the lingering adrenaline of the extraction. There were no tuxedos, no red silk dresses, no diamonds to hide behind. I found Colette standing by the chipped laminate counter, gripping a mug of black coffee like it was the only solid thing in a spinning world. She wore gray sweatpants and a borrowed oversized t-shirt, her hair loose and tangled from sleep. It was the first time in 3 years I had seen her without her armor. She looked softer, younger, and achingly accessible. I poured a cup and leaned against the doorframe, the ceramic warming my cold hands. The silence between us was heavy, but different. It wasn't the charged, electric silence of the car ride or the suffocating tension of the suite. It was the quiet of a battlefield after the smoke clears, when you have to count the casualties. The air felt thin, stripped of the jasmine and sea salt that had perfumed our lies. "I saw you," she said, her voice rough with sleep and truth. She didn't look up from the black liquid in her cup. "On the balcony. I saw the way you looked at me." "I know," I answered softly, watching the steam rise from my mug. "You told me to stop. I didn't want you to stop." She finally turned, and the raw vulnerability in her eyes knocked the wind out of me. It was a direct hit to the chest. "I wanted you to keep looking. I wanted to let you see everything. And that terrified me more than Markov ever could. I wasn't protecting the cover. I was protecting myself from how much I wanted it to be real." She set the mug down with a deliberate click. The sound echoed in the empty kitchen. "Can we still work together?" she asked. It was the professional question, the architect trying to salvage the equation, trying to find a variable she could still control. "Not like before," I said, shaking my head. "We can't go back to before. We can't pretend the study didn't happen. We can't pretend I don't know the weight of your surrender." Colette nodded slowly. She took a step toward me, crossing the invisible line we had drawn 3 years ago. She didn't check for bugs. She didn't scan the perimeter. She just closed the distance until she was standing in my personal space. Not as a tactic, but as a woman. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and cupped my face. Her thumb brushed my cheekbone, a touch that had no tactical purpose, no audience, no lie attached to it. It was grounding. It was real. It was the first time she had touched me without an objective, without a script. And the contact felt heavier than the mission itself, anchoring me to the spot. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted, her voice a whisper against my skin. "I don't know how to be partners and this. I don't know the rules." "We figure it out," I whispered back, leaning into her palm, closing my eyes against the gray light. "We improvise." We packed the final bag in silence, folding the red dress and the tuxedo away like costumes from a play we'd survived. The silk felt cold now, lifeless without the heat of the performance to animate it. We were leaving the fictional lovers behind in Italy, buried in the luxury of the resort. But we were bringing something far more dangerous home. The couple was a lie, but the women leaving the safe house were finally telling the truth. We walked onto the tarmac, the wind whipping our hair into a tangled mess, the distance between our bodies practically zero. The engine of the plane roared, drowning out the world, but the silence between us was no longer empty. It was full. Colette turned to me before boarding. She didn't look at me with the partner gaze anymore, that cool, detached assessment. She looked at me with the same heat I gave her on the balcony, unflinching and absolute. The mission required a lie, but it forced us to find the truth. If you want to hear more stories about the lines we cross for love, subscribe.